Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Gaines. I'd like to read you chapter 9. The Jaw of the Iron Dog. Jim knew one thing for sure. He must keep away from the policemen. If they see me, they'll send me back, he thought. He remembered the white-faced boys in the yard. But I'll run away again as soon as I get a chance. Somewhere in his head was the thought of finding Rosie again. She had been his mother's friend. Maybe, if he found her, he'd find Emily and Lizzie too. But London was a huge, throbbing, noisy place. He had no idea which way to go. The shops were still open and busy, and the streets were full of traders, carrying trays of fish and fruit, shouting out their wares. A woman was selling coffee from the handcart. The smell of it reminded of the morning in the kitchen of the big house when Rosie had given his mother some coffee of his lordship's. The night noises of the street baffled Jim. He had grown used to the drowning quiet of the workhouse and the distant midnight wails of the mad people in it. It seemed as if no one here wanted to sleep. He reckoned he was probably safer where there were many people around. Lots of boys about his age were dodging about from one side of the street to the other, in and out of the light of the lamps. It was easy to pretend to be one of them. Soon he stopped to rest against a shop wall, leaning next to another boy. He slid his hand into the pocket for a bit of his supper. The boy looked at Jim and stuffed the cheese into his mouth before he had a chance to grab it. "You from the workhouse?" the boy asked him. Jim shook his head. "Bet you are. The workhouse clothes, ain't they?" The boy was dressed in tattered trousers and a torn, thin jacket, but the cap on his head was the same as Jim's. Before Jim could speak to him, the boy snatched up the broom and was propped up beside him and darted out to stand beside a man in a top hat and a long coat. "Clear the road for you, sir," he said, and when the man nodded, the boy stepped out in front of him, brushing a pathway through the slush. The man tossed him a coin without looking at him. Jim ran after the boy. "Give us your clothes, and you can have mine," he offered. The boy laughed at him. "Not likely." He darted off with his broom across his shoulders. There was a sudden cackle of voices behind Jim. A woman selling pickled salmon was being shouted at by another woman with a tray of eels round her waist. Onlookers were joining in and bearing down on them. Their tall hats visible over their heads were two policemen. Jim put his head down and ran. As soon as he realised he was out of the busy area and that he was running through quiet streets without shops. The roads were wider here and the houses grand. They began to look familiar, and yet it was impossible to tell one from the other. He came to the dark square that was full of skinny trees. In the middle of it was a fountain, and, as if he'd looked through a window into his memory, he knew he'd been here before. He sat down on the fountain steps. He had sat here on his last journey when his mother had stopped to drink. He had trailed his hands in the water. A bit further back, he thought, there should be a statue of a man on a horse. He made himself stand up, hardly daring to look. There it was, the very statue. They'd stopped there too. She'd leaned against the statue, and he had seen the fountain and helped her across to it. She'd been so weak then, she could have been a little child. He remembered how helpless and frightened he had felt, and that had been over a year ago. He could hardly believe that it was a whole year since his mother had died. Emily and Lizzie didn't even know. All these things were just as they had been then. The man on the horse, the fountain in the big house. Only this time, his mother wasn't there. He walked slowly up to the statue. The streets led away from it. 3 long tree-lined streets, and one of them was the street where Rosie worked. If he found Rosie, he would find Emily and Lizzie again. He began to run. The houses all looked the same. They all had black railings and a little flight of steps going up to the main door, and a little flight leading down to the servants' quarters. Must he knock on every door in every street until he found the right one? He ran up the first street, and then he came back and tried the second. A sound caught his attention, and he looked round. Hanging from the window of one of the kitchens was a tiny cage. A finch, with just enough room to move, hopped from stand to floor and stand again, whistling out loud for a companion. Jim had heard that sound before. He was in the right street, and somewhere a long way up it was the house he was searching for. By the time he'd stopped again, he knew exactly what to look out for. He remembered he was with his mum and had sunk down onto the steps, and Lizzie had looked up at the grand house and asked if this is where they were going to live. He had seen something that made him hope that he wasn't. On the side of the step there had been a metal boot scraper in the shape of a dog's head, with a wide, vicious mouth. He remembered thinking that if he had put his foot inside the mouth, the metal teeth would have come clashing together and pinned him there for good. He ran from side to side of the street looking for it, and at last, there it was. He had found it. The house upstairs was in darkness, but down in the basement window he saw a soft glow of a candle. He tumbled down the steps, tripping himself up into his big boots, and fell against the door. "Emily! Emily!" he shouted. Before he could raise the fist to hammer on the door, it was pulled open, and he staggered against a girl. Oh, now I wonder, is this the house? Was that Emily? Had he found his family? I have to wait till next time. Thank you for listening.